Since the Battle of Chaeronea, Greek states have been dominated by the hegemony of Macedonia, that backwater kingdom in the north. The new king, young Alexander III, has led his army north, suppressing uprisings of barbaric peoples by the Danube and, most recently, in Illyria. It has been some time since any news of him reached them. But then, finally a word came. Alexander, son of Philip, was dead. In Thebes, statesmen exiled by the orders of Philip returned, and sparked a rebellion, calling for the people to free themselves of the Macedonian yoke and regain their freedom. With Alexander's death, they were no longer bound by the treaties imposed on them by the Macedonians. Unfortunately for them, Alexander's death was fake news, conjured by Demosthenes, a prominent Athenian statesman and an old rival of Philip. Alexander, still very much alive, successfully crushed the Illyrian resistance and quickly marched towards Thebes, covering vast distances too quickly to be challenged on the way. Now he stood outside of Thebes' walls, hesitating. At least, that's one version of the story. Arrian tells us that Alexander continuously refused to attack the city and begins chapter 8 so. But Ptolemy, son of Largos, tells us that Perdiccas, who had been posted in the advanced guard of the camp with his own brigade, and was not far from the enemy's stockade, did not wait for the signal from Alexander to commence the battle, but of his own accord was the first to assault the stockade, and, having made a breach in it, fell upon the advanced guard of the Thebans. Amyntas, son of Andromenes, followed Perdiccas, because he had been stationed with him. This general, also of his own accord, led on his brigade when he saw that Perdiccas had advanced within the stockade. When Alexander saw this, he led on the rest of his army, fearing that unsupported they might be intercepted by the Thebans and be in danger of destruction. He gave instructions to the archers and Agrianians to rush within the stockade, but he still retained the guards and shield-bearing troops outside. Then indeed Perdiccas, after forcing his way within the second stockade, fell there wounded by an arrow, and was carried back grievously injured to the camp, where he was with difficulty cured of his wound. However, the men of Perdiccas, in company with the archers sent by Alexander, fell upon the Thebans and shut them up in the hollow way leading to the temple of Heracles, and followed them in their retreat as far as the temple itself. Like in the previous chapter, the account of Arrian here differs greatly compared to other sources. He writes that the attack of the Macedonians upon Thebes was initiated by Perdiccas, without orders from Alexander. But, for example, Diodorus Siculus says that Alexander ordered and arranged the assault after vowing to utterly destroy the city for revolting against him and insulting him from their walls. The fault here probably falls less on Arrian, and more on his chief source, Ptolemy, who Arrian specifically names as his reference and who most probably took part in the battle. This is perhaps one of the most obvious spots where Ptolemy rewrote, or at least bent history to his will. As mentioned in the first episode, Ptolemy was very ambitious, and used Alexander's legacy to build his own dynasty in Egypt, after Alexander's death. To do this, he presented Alexander in the best possible light, while undermining his rival successors. Perdiccas was one such guy. He too was Alexander's companion and bodyguard, a natural leader and acclaimed soldier already from Philip's honor guard. He was also the one who caught Philip's assassin while he was escaping. In this context, while his initiative of the attack on Thebes might be entirely fictional, it could also be another sequence of his battle readiness that could be portrayed as brashness. In chapter 6, Perdiccas had partaken in Alexander's raid on Illyrians at Pelium, crossing the river at night and defeating their enemies through surprise attack. Amyntas, another of Alexander's officers, followed Perdiccas. Regardless of whether Perdiccas has acted on his own or on Alexander's orders, the attack on Thebes began and Alexander's troops advanced with great success, despite Perdiccas being severely wounded in the attack. But that was not the end. Arrian continues. The Thebans, having wheeled round, again advanced from that position with a shout, and put the Macedonians to flight. Eurybotus the Cretan, the captain of the archers, fell with about 70 of his men, but the rest fled to the Macedonian guard and the royal shield-bearing troops. Now, when Alexander saw that his own men were in flight, and that the Thebans had broken their ranks in pursuit, he attacked them with his phalanx drawn up in proper order, and drove them back within the gates. The Thebans fled in such a panic that being driven into the city through the gates they had not time to shut them. For the Macedonians, who were close behind the fugitives, rushed with them within the fortifications, inasmuch as the walls were destitute of defenders on account of the numerous pickets in front of them. When the Macedonians had entered the Cadmea, some of them marched out of it, in company with those who held the fortress, into the other part of the city opposite the temple of Amphion, but others crossing along the walls, which were now in the possession of those who had rushed in together with the fugitives, advanced with a run into the marketplace. Those of the Thebans who had been drawn up opposite the temple of Amphion stood their ground for a short time. But when the Macedonians under the command of Alexander were seen to be pressing hard upon them in various directions, their cavalry rushed through the city and sallied forth into the plain, and their infantry fled for safety as each man found it possible. Then indeed the Thebans, no longer defending themselves, were slain, not so much by the Macedonians as by the Phocians, Plataeans, and other Boeotians, who by indiscriminate slaughter vented their rage against them. Some were even attacked in the houses, having their turn to defend themselves from the enemy, and others were slain as they were supplicating the protection of the gods in the temples, not even the women and children being spared. About the Eurybotes from Crete, nothing else is known. Cretans were one of the few of ancient European peoples who provided their warriors with proper archery training. They were usually employed as mercenaries and were probably already employed by Philip. Cretan archers would continue to be an important unit in Alexander's auxiliary army, as they have already been in the Battle of Pelium. The Thebans made a brave and desperate resistance for a long time, but were in the end slaughtered by armies of both Macedonia and their allies. It is probable that Ptolemy, who was Arrian's authority, wished to exonerate Alexander from the guilt of destroying Thebes. As such, he ascribed the initiative of raising Thebes to Phocians, Plataeans, and other Boeotians. But even if they had acted on their own, without Alexander's orders, he could have probably still stopped them, if he so chose. Or could he? At this time, he was still an unproven, though talented, young king in the eyes of the Greek city-states. And while he could control his own soldiers and closest allies in the wildlands of Thrace and Illyria, the Greeks had their own ambitions, motives, and a history of grudges against one another. Just like the Thebans couldn't stand being in submission to Macedonia, perhaps these peoples too were tired of being supplicants to Thebes and were burning with revenge. Even if Alexander would have given an order to stop, would they really listen? Murder and rape were customary things that came along with looting a defeated city. Whatever the case, history would remember Alexander as the one who burned down the great city of Thebes. This would be an example to other city-states who would think again about the rebellion. Now, fear would be a major way to keep Greece in line. It is doubtful that Alexander was ignorant of this effect and the power that terror brought. According to Plutarch and Diodorus, 6,000 Thebans were slain and 30,000 sold into slavery. 500 Macedonians died in the assault, a low number compared to the defeated Thebans, but also relatively high compared to the previous battles of Alexander. What will be the ultimate fate of Thebes? Where will Alexander go next? We will find out in the next chapter.